Hey, how you doing? We're going to try to keep it light for today going into spring break. Wanted to talk a little bit about some things related to elections. We transitioned yesterday from interest groups being involved in lobbying to how those lobbying efforts try to sway congressmen in their reelection efforts. And so, as we will come back from spring break, we're going to talk a lot about campaign finance reform and some of the laws involving campaign finance. But I thought this would be a good time to review a couple things related to elections, as well as talk about a couple of new items about how individuals make their choices. So I'm just going to share this PowerPoint with you for you to kind of go through on your own. I think we have talked about some of this stuff already. I think we talked about primaries when we talked about the presidency. Remember, the presidency as an institution is part of that AP content that they're going to test you on. Remember, we've seen the updates now. 4 FRQs is what we're looking at for the testing, 45 minutes on your own device. And so I think it's worth your time to review this stuff related to presidential primaries specifically. So remember, with primaries, we're simply nominating candidates. We've got a lot of people who want the job. We're figuring out who from our party is the person we think would be the best person to run in November. And so go through and click on some of these links. Related to presidential primaries, we talked about the difference between open and closed. In a closed primary, you have to declare party affiliation in order to vote. In an open primary, you can remain an independent and still vote on candidates. Presidential primaries, remember, they're staggered throughout the spring. Each state is holding their own primary at a different time. The results of those primaries from a popular vote standpoint, remember those results reflect the number of delegates that the state will send to the National Convention. The National Convention is where we do the official voting to find out who the nominee will be. I think at this point, if you click on the link here, oops, excuse me, this one talks about delegates and superdelegates, which we covered before. Senator, you may have one mission. So you can enjoy that video at your leisure. If you take a look at the totals here, you can see that Biden is in the lead. They need 1991 to win. He's at about 1,100. President Trump has already sewn up the nomination based on his delegate count. And so again, when we go to the conventions in the summer, there shouldn't be a lot of excitement because we already know who the nominee will be for each side. Now we've obviously covered general elections where you're choosing winners. So let's take a little bit of a look at eligibility to vote, constitutional requirements about who can vote and how those have changed. Originally, when the Constitution was drafted, you see white male landowners who are 21 and older who are eligible to vote. The religious tests were an early requirement, and that goes away first. And then the next thing to go away is the landowning requirement. So by the 1830s, you're looking at white males 21 and older who are eligible to vote. And I think we have talked about some of these constitutional amendments, but here they are again. Remember, this is probably not a new one, but it's been a while since we've talked about this when we talked about Congress. Originally, your state's legislative branch would choose your state's 2 senators, but that changed after the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct popular election of senators rather than through your state legislatures. And I think all the rest of these on the list we have talked about before. I know during the Civil Rights Unit, remember that's part of the content for the AP test. Civil rights and civil liberties, that's chunk number 3. And so we talked about how the Voting Rights Act expanded some of those guarantees under the 15th Amendment. I think this is content that's a little bit new, talking about voter turnout by election type. And so presidential elections have the most amount of turnout, with about 55% as the average. Remember, in a presidential election, you're looking at voting for president, all 435 House members. A third of the Senate is up for re-election. Lots of states will have governors up for election. Lots of states will have their state's Congress up for election. And so there are the most things on the ballot, and that's when we see the highest turnout, 55%. Now, that's pretty bad compared to other Western industrialized, I should say post-industrialized nations. We're looking at most other countries in the upper 60s to 70s. I think Australia has an 89, 91% voter turnout. They'd have a small fine that they levy on people who are able to vote but don't. There's all kinds of things that relate to that. One of the things is we calculate our voter eligibility based on, or our turnout, I should say, based on eligible voters, not just registered. And so obviously, if you register to vote, you're certainly more likely to be interested in politics and actually follow through and vote than just if you're eligible. And some of those other countries that are ahead of us calculate turnout based on who's registered to vote, because that indicates who's going to be actually likely to participate in the process. In a midterm election, you're looking at about 35 to 40%. It was a huge turnout in 2018, but that is not the norm. The norm is 35 to 40. And it's interesting because there's everything that would be up for election that there would be in a presidential election, just minus the president, and yet we see drastic drops in turnout. Now, in primaries and off-year elections, you're looking at about 20 to 25%. Depending on where you live, there might not be even any competitive primaries, so that sort of makes sense. I mean, why show up when there's nobody on your ballot? Like, who's running against Bob Gibbs this year on the Republican side? My guess is nobody. And so for a lot of people, like, there's just not enough on your ballot to make it worth showing up. Let's take a quick look at voter demographic turnout. Turnout by income: the more money you have, the more likely you are to show up and vote. And you can obviously go through these at your own pace. The older you are, the more likely you are to show up and vote. Whites tend to vote at a higher rate than minority groups, and the more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote. These are some things that perhaps harm voter turnout in the U.S. One of them is registration requirements. So like in Ohio, you have to be registered 30 days before the election. States that have same-day registration, where you just show up and register to vote and then right away cast your ballot, those states tend to have higher voter turnout. One of the things that's helped, the Motor Voter Bill of 1993, I think, maybe 96, it's called oh no, I'm forgetting it, but it's informally referred to as the Motor Voter Bill. Basically, you can register to vote when you renew your driver's license. And the idea behind this was it was going to help make it easier to vote for tons of people. It actually increased registration a lot, but it didn't do much for turnout. The other thing they used to do that law changed was they used to purge the poll books. Like if you didn't show up and vote in a single election, they had assumed that you either died or had moved and were no longer there, and that's why you weren't voting. And so they would cross your name off the registered list. And so essentially, if you had missed an election, then you would have to re-register to vote. And that was an obstacle, but that was eliminated with that 96 law. And then that was reaffirmed in 2002's Help America Vote Act, the idea that states can't purge the poll book just because you didn't show up to vote. There's quite a few hoops that the state has to jump through before they can remove your name for failure to vote. One of the other obstacles is obviously the election day being on a Tuesday. If you're not in your precinct on the day of the election, that can make it difficult, particularly like college students. You're not in your home precinct on the day of election. Now, there are things that can help that, things like absentee voting, where you mail in a request, they mail you the ballot, and then you fill it out and mail it back in. And then early voting periods, where the Board of Election office will be open like 2 weeks before Election Day, including Saturdays as you get closer to Election Day, in order to facilitate ease of voting for people. Now, some political scientists have hypothesized that it's perhaps all that early voting that actually makes numbers go down. When there was only one day to vote on Tuesday, showing up to the polls on Tuesday after work with a ton of people from your neighborhood, it kind of created that camaraderie, and it created that social pressure to vote. Like you wanted people to see you there doing your civic duty. And in fact, in the old days, it was kind of a celebration. Like there was a potluck at your voting place. People would show up, they'd bring food, they'd hang out, they'd bring their families. But those days are long gone, and so maybe some of that the social benefits and the social pressure of voting same day are eliminated when you open it up for 2 weeks, because how would anybody know if you voted or not? Just because you don't show up on election day doesn't mean that you didn't cast a ballot, but it actually reduces that pressure for some people. Last up of the new stuff, taking a look at voter behavior. What is it that helps people make a decision? Well, we had talked before about party line voting. Probably the number one predictor of how you're going to vote for an office. And it makes sense. It's a rational decision. Like if somebody says they're Republican and you think you're Republican, then by golly, most of your views are probably going to line up, especially for down ballot issues. Offices that people have no idea who the candidates are, party is the number one thing. As long as you see an R beside that person's name, you're going down the list and clicking every R that you see. We have seen a little bit more split ticket voting, and the rise of candidate-centered politics has helped do that. It's easy for me to see who these people are now because of 24-hour news networks, because of social media. Like, I can see who the candidates are. I can feel like I get to know them. And so I don't necessarily have to go party line, because it is more possible now for me to know who those candidates are. But I still think that that's limited to more national offices. President, obviously, governor, senator. Most people don't know their congressman. And so anything from that on down, you're probably still using party line voting. And then some individual preferences. The rational choice model is the idea of what's my best interest in voting here? Whose policies will benefit me the most? You can look at it from an economic standpoint, and that's called pocketbook voting. Who gives me the best chance to make money, to do well financially over the next 4 years? You could also look at it from a social standpoint. Which of these candidates is going to do the best in protecting my individual rights and giving me the most freedom? Another one is called retrospective voting, and that idea is encapsulated here. If you click on the Reagan link and watch his famous closing in his speech in the 1980 election, look, the last 4 years, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? If you are, then you vote for the people who are still in charge. But if you feel like the last 4 years you're worse off today than you were when you started, then vote for somebody else. And then prospective voting, that just refers to who do I think will do the best over the next 4 years. And so that's not necessarily looking at performance of the party in charge or the candidate in charge. It's looking to whose ideas do I think will be better for the direction that the country is going to go. The last little bit I have on here is some voting procedure stuff, and you can click on those looking at our voter registration forms. You can take a look at some of these things. You can type in people's names and see if they're registered to vote, see where they're registered to vote. These are all things that the state of Ohio has done to facilitate ease of voting. In Ohio, you need to have a voter ID. I think that was one of the things I forgot to mention actually in the obstacle slide, voter ID requirements. It's become a controversial issue. Some states require strict photo ID in order to vote. Others, like Ohio, are kind of mixed. We ask for photo ID, but we will also accept things like a utility bill. We're really trying to prove residency more than we are identity. So in Ohio, it's best to bring a driver's license, but you don't have to. If you click on the link that I included there on the slide about obstacles to voting, you can see a short video about what kinds of individuals lack photo ID and what's acceptable and what's not. That will help at least give you some base info about why those laws are controversial. But that's all I have for you today. Enjoy your spring break, and we're coming back to 3 more weeks of this, so hopefully we can all come back a little bit recharged from our vacations of going from the living room to the family room. See you in a week.